One of the most important details of precision hand loading is setting neck tension. Being able to consistently set the optimal neck tension for our reloads is one of the biggest keys to keeping our standard deviations and extreme spreads low. A recent quote from Scott Satterley, a top competitor in PRS competition, I am paraphrasing slightly here, said, "The number one key to consistency is not your powder charge or your reloading press. If you can control your neck tension, you're way ahead of just about everybody else as far as being able to control your standard deviations and run out." In today's video, we're going to go over some real data to get a little bit closer to find out what combination gives us the optimal neck tension for the best performance in our reloads. Before someone goes and gets offended, if you're happy with the performance you're getting out of your reloads, I'm happy for you and glad that you found the best combination for you. Unfortunately, discussing this topic somehow makes some people think that I'm telling you that you're doing it wrong. I am not accusing your mother of bringing a store-bought pie to Thanksgiving dinner. I just want to bring some data to a conversation that seems to lack data and hard numbers. In God we trust, all others bring data. I'm hoping to try as many different options and bring that information to those who are interested in it. If I'm not covering your specific method, I may cover it in an additional video. Overall, it would be nice to know if there's a universal value that is best, and if we change it, how does that actually affect the performance? What are we losing? What are we gaining? This is what we're trying to address in today's video. Since I'm sure there's some newer loaders in the audience, I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over some definitions that will hopefully make this be understood better. Some of these terms can often mean different things to different people. Anytime we talk about something like neck tension, I think it's important we try and understand the definitions behind it. Let's start out with something fun, like Sammy's definition for neck tension, which is something like the circumferential stress that the case neck exerts on the seated projectile as a result of the interference fit provided by the case neck inside diameter and the projectile outside diameter. I'm not sure that's how I would personally have defined it, but hey, I guess it's a good start. Possibly a more common definition you might run into is the actual amount of force required to seat the projectile into or pull out of a case. You may use something like an arbor press with a force pack to monitor this value as you seat your projectiles. Yet another way of defining this term is the difference in the projectile's diameter to the inside diameter of the neck after the sizing operation is complete. So if the projectile is 308 and the inside of the case neck was to measure 306, you're essentially using 2/1000ths of neck tension. More often, I hear this term being used by measuring a loaded round and picking a bushing that is so many thousandths smaller than that value and referring to that as the amount of neck tension. This definition very frequently does not account for any brass spring back that the case might have, but it's pretty easy to understand and fairly easy to repeat it. Quickly, let's review 4 ways we can actually set the neck tension on our case. The first option is using a standard die to smash down the case neck and run an expander ball back up through it to set your neck dimension. Whatever dimension your expander might be, typically it's like 2/1000ths under bullet diameter, but that is going to set the neck tension for your case. Option number 2, and the most common when I hear this being discussed, is the use of bushing dies. Redding's S-die is possibly the most famous, but they have bushings that are sold in 1/1000th increments to set the outside neck diameter. The downside of this method, if you have any variation in your case neck thickness by brand or just variation in your lot, your case neck tension can vary slightly. The third option, and the one I've used the most, and the one I used in my last neck tension video, was the use of expander mandrels. These allow you to use your standard full-length sizing die, or bushing die, whichever you choose, and use an expander mandrel through the inside of the case neck to set that final neck diameter after the outside case has already been sized. Personally, I've found that this gives me the best concentricity numbers, but your results may vary. Secret option number 4 is custom honed dies. Certain die manufacturers will allow you to open the case neck dimension up on your full-length sizing die to minimize the amount of squeeze that the full-length sizing die is doing. Negative side of this is it's a permanent modification. You can't just swap in a new bushing to change it back. You need to be very sure that's the dimension that you want because you're not going to be altering it any smaller. Now, as far as definitions are concerned for today's testing, I'm going to be referring to this as simply the way the sizing was accomplished. My standard process and our control group for today's test will be using a standard full-length sizing die by Forrester, removing the expander ball completely, full-length sizing it, and then using a 306 expander mandrel to set up the final neck diameter. All cases today have been annealed with my amp annealer, and the shoulder bump, regardless of the sizing die used, will be set at 2/1000ths. For the bushing testing we're doing today, we are going to be utilizing a Redding S full-length bushing die, bumping our shoulder back that same 2/1000ths, and using various combinations of bushings to adjust our neck tension. The last time we ran this test, we were simply using a full-length sizing die without the expanding device installed and using various expander mandrels to set that final neck dimension. Setting the neck dimension, we didn't have to be as concerned with the neck thickness, but to better understand today's data, the final neck dimension of our 308 brass is going to be 0.335 inches after it's full-length sized and the 306 expander mandrel sets that neck dimension. This time we're primarily going to be using bushings to set our various neck tension, but understanding that our standard process yields a 0.335 inch dimension should help you better understand today's data. I have not picked up any pin gauges since the last time we were reviewing neck tension here on the channel, so again, today's data we're not going to be accounting for brass spring back with our measurements, but we are going to be going over the sizing process that got our result. We're all aware that that's a factor, but again, this should be easy to understand how I set the neck tension and if you would like to repeat it that way. On a positive side, I have acquired the arbor press with the force pack, so this time we're going to be having some very interesting data how the sealing force contributes to velocity variation. So make sure you stick around to the end to make sure you catch it. To be clear, brass spring back will change the value of neck tension. However, I have no way of precisely measuring it yet, but you should have no trouble understanding how today's testing was done, so if you could repeat it and measure it if you desire. And I would encourage you to do so for your own process. Other things that can affect your neck tension besides your sizing process, just throwing a couple out there, are neck wall thickness, the amount of projectile in the neck, so your seating depth can affect it, how clean the inside of the neck case is, the length of the cartridge neck, like 300 Win Mag versus 30-06, have very different neck dimensions and thus going to have different neck tension depending on seating depth. Coatings that could be on the projectile can affect this value. If you anneal your brass or don't anneal your brass, and if you don't anneal your brass, how many firings are on it can affect this value. The time duration between the seating and the actual firing of the cases can also affect the neck tension of your reloads. There are likely even more factors besides the sizing dimension to think about, but do we really care? What we really need to know is, does it affect our velocity, repeatability, statistics, and accuracy? There's lots of advice out there. I've heard 0.02 of neck tension an awful lot. The U.S. Army Marksmanship Unit suggests hand loaders start with a neck tension bushing that is 0.03 less than the outside loaded diameter, but let's just look at our data and see what it says. So for today's test, before anyone loses their mind, one test is not going to be the end-all test to show which neck tension is best. It's likely you'll have to test this for yourself. Our load today is the same load that we used to test our neck tension with our expander mandrels. This load was originally worked up with a different manufacturer's brass, set with 0.02 of neck tension, but it used the same process as our control group today, full-length sizing, no expander, and then using the 306 expander mandrel to set the final neck tension. For our testing today, we're going to be using liable brass, 2 times previously fired in 308 Winchester. Our load today is using IMR 8208 XBR at 40.8 grains for every charge. The primer we're using for today's test is the Fed 210M. The cartridge overall length we'll be using is 2.802 inches, so our CBTO is about 2.215 inches. Neck tension is what we're testing, so the different variables that we will be testing today is our standard full-length die with a 306 mandrel, a 334 bushing through 337 bushing in 1/1000th increments, and then 2 other options. One is the 334 bushing using the 306 mandrel, and then a 336 bushing using the 306 mandrel. Our projectile stays the same. It's the 175 grain Sierra Match King, part number 2275. It's the same projectile used in Federal's gold medal match ammunition, which this load is loosely based on. So first things first, let's actually look at our groups. Our standard die in our control group for today actually started off with a .973 MOA group. Moving to our 334 bushing, yielded a 1.238 MOA group. Our 335 bushing yielded a 1.049 MOA group. Our .336 bushing yielded a 1.249 MOA group. The group from our .337 bushing yielded a .167 MOA group. Now when we used our 334 bushing with our 306 mandrel, our group size dropped to .965 MOA. And our .336 bushing with our 306 mandrel yielded a .982 MOA group. Interesting to me, by using that 306 mandrel, it seemed to, even though we'd sized it with our bushing, brought our group size almost identical to our control group for the day. But before we get lost in our group, let's see how combustion was affected. Our standard die with 306 mandrel yielded a standard deviation of 5.3 with an extreme spread of 12. Our 334 bushing, our standard deviation jumped to 11.9 with an extreme spread of 31. Our 335 bushing jumped again to a standard deviation of 16.7 with an extreme spread of 40. At 336 bushing, our standard deviation dropped slightly to 14.6, but our extreme spread opened up to 44. With the 337 bushing, the standard deviation dropped to 10.7 with an extreme spread of 29. When we go back to our combinations, our 334 bushing with the 306 mandrel, our standard deviation was 12 with an extreme spread of 34. And our 336 bushing with the 306 mandrel, our standard deviation dropped to 7.3 with an extreme spread of only 22. Interesting enough, our standard process with 306 mandrel seemed to win again. Keep in mind that when we developed this load, 2,000 neck tension on our standard process what was developed with. So that charge weight was picked with that neck tension setting. Had we worked up with a different combination, maybe we would have got a different answer. Interesting to me again though, our standard process, full length sizing with 306 mandrel gave us our best results. One piece of information that we didn't have before was our seating force. So let's look at that information. One thing that's important to remember when we look at this data is how the physical sizing process happens. Using the bushing die, it's actually not possible to size the entire neck with the bushing based on the construction of the die. There's always going to be a small portion of brass at the base of the neck that doesn't get sized when you're using a bushing die. So even though we might be using a bushing that should be getting us more neck tension than our full length sizing die, we might not achieve that value because we did not size the entire length of the neck. So how I'm going over the seating force here is I recorded the seating force on every round from where the projectile actually started to seat and what the final force was when the seating process was complete. We can see that our standard full-length die with the 306 mandrel, our starting force was around 39 pounds, and we did not complete the seating process until we'd reached an average of 108 pounds. 334 bushing was 48 and 87. 335 bushing started at 40 and ended at 76. The 336 bushing started at 38, ended at 77, and our 337 bushing started at 27 and ended at 60. The next piece of data here I find to be very interesting. Looking at the 334 bushing and using the 306 mandrel, the starting force of 28 is certainly lower than the 334 bushing by itself, but the average finishing force of 92 is slightly higher than 87. That value certainly surprised me, but that's what it is. And we can see our last combination, 336 bushing with 306 mandrel, had our lowest starting force at 20 pounds, finishing off at 67. Now, if you'd like to see the individual data from every single round, I'm going to put it on your screen, but it is a little bit of an eye chart. I'm not sure how well it's going to come through for you, but you can see starting force, ending force, plotted with the same rounds as the velocity. So even though some of those values were very, very consistent, it did not always make the velocity be as consistent as we would like. But look at that to your heart's content. I'd encourage you to pause it if you like. Overall, I'm not sure if there's any variation in seating force that's clearly represented in outliers in velocity, but this subject probably deserves its own video. It's funny to me that our standard full-length sizing die and 306 expander mandrel seem to perform the best, just like in the previous test that we ran. Standard deviations were almost identical. The previous test standard deviation was 5.6, today's test was 5.3. Our previous extreme spread with this identical combination was 18, and this time we achieved 12. That's pretty darn repeatable, and again, pretty much the best performer. If you haven't seen that video already, I'll put a card up. I encourage you to check that video out. It's certainly some good supplemental information to this test. I am curious to see if we did a velocity curve test with each one of these neck tension variables, would we find a different result? And we find that one combination provided a better result. Essentially, would we have a plateau at a different spot, which would give us more consistent ignition on a different variable? I would like to run some more testing and try some different combinations, and I always appreciate your suggestions in the comments section below. If you want to see more examples of how neck tension affects the performance of your reloads, I encourage you to check out this playlist to learn more, or check out one of these other videos that YouTube thinks you might enjoy. Like, subscribe, and all that fun stuff. I hope to see you come back next week, and until then, stay safe in small groups.